Hi, welcome to this video about the basics of fiction. This video isn't tied to any specific literature course. It's meant to be just an introduction to a lot of the similar terms and ideas that you're going to find in multiple genres, though not everything will apply equally to every course, so just realize that. So the first thing we'll look at is what is fiction. So fiction is just anything that's not factual. It could be poetry, it could be prose, and it can be based on actual real people or real events, but the story itself is made up in some part, right? There are usually going to be specific elements associated with fiction, such as plot, point of view, character, setting, symbol, and theme. Uh, those are usually going to be there for prose. For poetry, plot isn't necessarily that important because really short poems don't have a long sequel of events, right? So again, some of these are going to be more associated with certain genres, but again, it's a good idea to know what they are in general so you know when you need them, right? And then we're also going to have symbolic or figurative language, that things like metaphor, simile, allegory. Again, there are lots of those things out there. This is just going to give us some of the more basic ones. And know that in this class, when we're looking at a piece of work, I will give you a list of any of those genre elements or symbolic or figurative ideas that you need to know for that particular work. So plot is basically just the series of events that occurs in the story. In traditional plots, they are very linear and they're causally related. So one thing happens and there's a reaction to that thing, and then the next thing happens, right? They're usually chronological. We sometimes will have flashbacks that disrupt that linear movement. This is where a character will think about something that happened in the past that gives us important information, and we're not told that till that point. And that can be sometimes really important. Sometimes authors will hold those flashbacks so that we get an impression that X is true, and then we get the flashback, and it's like, oh, wait a second, that kind of gives me a different feel about things, right? So again, flashbacks can disrupt linear emotion, and then some plots will be completely unlinear. If you've seen the movie Pulp Fiction, that does not follow any kind of chronological order, and that's part of the charm, but also part of the mystery to kind of figure out, right? But pretty much everything that you're going to study in most of the survey classes, until you get maybe into more contemporary eras, are going to be pretty linear. The main character in a story is called a protagonist. The word agon comes from the Greek that means actor, and proto means first. So, first actor, who is the main person. Now, realize that a protagonist is not necessarily a hero or a villain. A protagonist is just who is the story about. In heroic fiction, the protagonist is going to be a hero, right? But in other stories, maybe you have a story about Hitler. Well, Hitler is not a hero, right? At least for most of us. So it might be about him. He is the protagonist, but he's not heroic. So just realize that. The character that is opposite the protagonist is the antagonist. Anta meaning opposite. So if it's a heroic story where the protagonist is a hero, then the antagonist is a villain. But in a story where there isn't that clear distinction, the antagonist is just someone that is opposing the main character. If the main character is a bad guy, then the antagonist is usually a good guy. If the main character is a guy that's just deluded but isn't evil, then the antagonist could be a friend that's just trying to say, dude, wake up, right? So it's just anybody that's getting in the way of the main character getting what they want. This leads us to conflict. What do these characters want? So, conflict is basically the character is struggling for something. And that is the battle that is played out over the course of the work. And again, if we have really short works, really short fiction, there might not be a really well developed sense of conflict. This is something that, needs time to develop. But things like haiku that are only 17 syllables, they can give us an abstract reflection of a conflict that humans face. And the haiku is supposed to be something that helps us meditate on that and have an epiphany about that conflict. So even short poems can have conflicts. They're just not going to be the same as a drama or an epic, right? So again, what does the main character want? What is getting in the way of that? That can help us identify antagonist, protagonist. Now, we have two basic types of conflict, and I see I've got a typo on my screen. Internal conflict is man versus self, not man versus man. I apologize. I think it's right on the next screen. Yes, man versus self. So there's only one type of internal conflict. This is where I, the protagonist, am getting in my own way. And usually there is ambition, fear, jealousy, or pride. Those are the biggies that most dramatic fiction identifies as the main conflict. But, maybe I'm just inept and I have taken on a job that I can't do and I just can't do it. That's what's keeping me from being successful. That usually can be driven to, though, ambition is making me tackle a job that I can't do, or pride, right? So this is what we're going to look at. It's my own fears, weaknesses, whatever, that's keeping me from getting what I want. Then we have multiple other kinds of external conflicts where it's something else outside of me that's causing the problem. The first is man versus man. This is that typical hero villain, Superman versus Lex Luthor kind of battle. But again, it can be any two opposing forces, whether the antagonist is good or bad. It's just he is trying to, or she is preventing the hero or the protagonist getting what they want. So if you can identify there is one particular person doing this, then you've got man versus man, or people versus people, or human versus human, however you want to say it. Man versus society is where the opposing force is a group that share the same values or goal or something, and they are getting in the main character's way. Now, sometimes that group could be represented by an individual, and so it might look like man versus man, but if that antagonist is really the mouthpiece for an organization or a group, then you've got to consider whether it's really man versus society. So let me give you an example. In The Matrix, the first movie, you had Neo versus Mr. Smith, right? And Mr. Smith was a representative of the Matrix, of the architect. And everything he did to get in Neo's way was as a representative of this society that didn't want Neo to break the humans free, right? But by the time you get to the second and third movies, Mr. Smith has now left the collective, if you will, and he is acting on his own. He wants to destroy Neo personally. And so where he is more man versus society in the first movie, definitely by the second and third movie, he is man versus man conflict. So you see that character change and stop representing the group to represent his own self. So this is, again, one of the things that you might look at. Is this person just acting as a representative, or are they acting independently on their own? Man versus the supernatural, which can include fate and the gods, as well as aliens, right? So spiritual or extraterrestrial forces. Again, the battle can be against destiny or fate. But sometimes when a character is battling against fate, it can actually be more of a battle against self. If he is battling against his fate because he is afraid, then is it really battle versus fate, or is it self? So again, these are things that we can argue about. These are things that we can have a difference of opinion about, whether, it is this or it's that. And we just bring evidence from the story and our own reasoning. And we might have different interpretations, but they both are equally valid. Man versus nature. So this is where you're fighting the world, the planet, something that is not human, but is of nature. So it's not extraterrestrial, it's on this planet. There are two types here. The first type, nature, is just nature. It is not out to get us. It doesn't have an agenda. It is just this powerful force. So a tornado will destroy. It's not targeting your house particularly, right? It's just, it is what it is, right? You go out into hunting and a bear attacks you. The bear didn't track you and didn't intend to kill you. It's just doing what it does, right? So that's one type of nature. The other, though, is where nature is malevolent, and this is where it is out to get us. So the shark in Jaws, right? Especially in Jaws 2, which is actually called Jaws the Revenge. This is where the mother of the shark that's killed in the first one comes to look for these people and get revenge. That's man versus nature, where nature is malevolent, right? In the first one, I think you could make an argument either way, that that great white shark was just, but most sharks don't eat humans. That's the thing, right? So I think we could even say in that first movie, it was a malevolent beast, right? If the tornado is sentient and targeting, right, then that is man versus nature, where it is malevolent. So again, realize that that's a different way you can even have more in-depth analysis, saying, yeah, and this is nature where it's really out to get us. It's putting us in our place, right? Man versus technology. So this is anything that is not natural. This is human made. We oftentimes associate that with maybe like science fiction or modern stuff. So the Terminator, Matrix, these are all man versus technology. But actually, it's any tech, right? So a bridge, a wagon, right? These are all things that are not new tech. Like I said, Friend Flintstone is yabba dabba doing, and he gets a flat on his stone wheel. That's man versus technology, because that stone wheel is not natural. They have crafted it, and it is something that is broken. So man versus technology isn't just for modern fiction. It actually can go back and be ancient as well. So when we're looking at a story, especially a long story, it helps to be able to break down the plot into certain places that things are occurring, right? And Freytag is someone that invented what we call Freytag's pyramid, that actually gives us a visual representation of that. So these are the points of Freytag's pyramid. Exposition is just background information that we get to help us understand the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Really great authors are good about only giving us what we need to know and giving it when we need to know it, so we don't have this big info dump, or we don't have a lot more information than what we actually need to know. Like, did I really need to know that there are 3 types of cheeses? He only needs 1 cheese, right? So again, sometimes poorly done exposition can really slow a plot down or be confusing, right? We have rising action. So the plot starts off with something happens that causes a conflict. And then as that conflict is played out, every scene gets a little bit tighter in terms of the tension, right? And that leads to the climax. This is the moment of the most intense tension, where the conflict is then going to be resolved. But we don't know, right? Once it is resolved, whether the hero wins or the protagonist wins or loses the battle, then we have the falling action. And this is where we see the immediate consequences, or, of what's going on, the falling out, right? So if the protagonist loses and he has bet his family's fortune on this, then we can see the family suffering, right? This is part of that, what happens. Then we have the conclusion, or sometimes called the denouement. This is where the loose ends are all tied up. So there aren't any plot elements that are left out there unresolved. Everything neatly falls back, and we're back into a world where order has been restored. Most stories are about something that kind of kicks us into chaos, right? Something happens that's not usual. And at the end, we want a stable, normal situation. That doesn't mean it's a happy world, but again, things are back to normal. And so you can see here, this is one way that you can see the pyramid, right? Where something starts off, we have that inciting incident, the action gets higher, until we get the climax, and then things are resolved, right? So this is where you want to look. And again, there are stories where I've had disagreements with people about what the climax is. It really depends on what you think the conflict is, right? And because conflicts can, if it's a really complicated story, you might disagree with someone about what is the main conflict that the hero or the protagonist is facing, right? You may see that it is an internal conflict, but maybe they see it as an external. Well, depending on what you think the conflict is, that might change where the climax is. So again, these are things that are open to interpretation. We're going to do another video about the hero's journey, so I'm not going to talk about it a lot here. The hero's journey is just a really great way to break down fiction, and it works for so many types of fiction that it's really helpful to understand the patterns. So we're going to have another video with another PowerPoint that goes into depth, so I'm just going to skip over that right now. So character, who are the people in the story? Well, you have two types, flat versus round, and this is about mutability or change, right? If a character doesn't change, they don't grow, they don't learn, we call them flat. Nothing happens, right? They're static, right? If you have a character that does change, we call them round. They're well developed, right? So usually you're going to have your major characters are going to be round, and minor characters are usually going to be flat. You also have stock characters. So these are kind of fill-ins. These are, sometimes we would think they're stereotypes. They're based on a really familiar kind of character like the jock or, you know, the Cinderella or something like that. You know, for an unskilled author, a stock character can be boring. They can be, you know, maybe offensive because they're so stereotypical. But for a really good author, they become characters that it's easy to know who they are because they're predictable, but not in a way that's boring. They're predictable in a way that's familiar and that helps us. So stock characters are not bad on their own. They can be bad, but they're just part of literature, right? You have main characters. These are the ones who are making the decisions. They're the ones that have conflict. They're almost always round. I can't think of many times where we didn't have a character that was static, that was a main character. You might not see a whole lot of change, but there is some kind of change. Then we have supporting characters. These are the characters that aren't really responsible for making major decisions. They're really there to support the main characters in some way, and usually they tend to be more flat. You can have a supporting character that has some change, but usually it's not much. Now, the longer and more in-depth a work is, the more likely you're going to have main characters and then characters that have a lot of agency in the story that might be considered supporting characters, but they have their own kind of secondary plot lines. So again, there are some fictions that have a little bit more strata of main and then maybe secondary main characters and then supporting characters. So I think about main characters and secondary characters can have roundness. Supporting characters usually, they just come in, they might just be in one scene. They do what they do and they leave, and that's it. So how do we tell things about characters? Well, here are some ways for you to look at a story to figure out what's going on. So you're going to have a narrator that is telling the story, and they are going to be describing these characters to us. And sometimes there will be a judgment, like, oh, that character is just they're lazy, right? Or they could just be giving a very objective description, right? So think about, how is that character described? And is that description tinged with any kind of judgment, right? You can also look at surface details of their dress and physical appearance. What do they look like? How do they comport themselves? Do they have always stains on their clothes, right? If you're a fan of the Ocean's 11 series, right, with George Clooney and Brad Pitt, one of the interesting things about Brad Pitt's character, and go back and watch these, is that he's almost always eating in every scene that he's in, right? And that's a really important kind of thing to understand about Rusty. He's constantly hungry, right? We also can understand character by what they say and what they do. And if there is a discrepancy between what someone says and then what they do, then that's important to consider. Oh, you say that you're for free speech, but when anyone wants to say something you don't like, you want to shut them down. There's a discrepancy there. So what do characters say and what do they do, right? And then if we're allowed to get inside of their head, we can also look at their consciousness, right? You know, if that's expressed in any way, then that also is a clue to help us understand who these people are. So we talked about narrators, and that comes under point of view. Who is telling the story? Whose eyes are we seeing the story through? So we have an external versus internal. In an external narrator, they are not part of the story at all. They are observing it from outside of the events, right? If they are internal, that means that they are part of the story. So we have to consider then how objective are they and how reliable are they if they are part of the story itself. Now, you can have an external narrator that is also biased, right? It doesn't mean that they aren't, but again, we would expect that an internal narrator has something to gain or lose by the event, so they might be a little bit more biased, right? You have reliable versus unreliable. Can we trust them? Are they going to tell us everything honestly and objectively? Or are they going to have some kind of impartiality? The Great Gatsby is a really good example of this. The Great Gatsby is narrated by Nick. And Gatsby is presented to us as this tragic hero, but when we really look at who he is and what he does, it's like, well, no, he's really not very heroic, right? He's kind of a criminal and he's obsessive, right? Well, if we think about that, well, who was telling the story? Well, Nick idolized Gatsby. So obviously he's going to talk about him as a hero. But we're supposed to look at what Gatsby does and realize that Nick does not have the most objective, reliable viewpoint, right? And so that's part of the story to help us unwind. And if you don't realize that, then you might be going like, what's up with Fitzgerald talking about Gatsby as a great guy? I mean, he was kind of screwed up. Well, no, Gatsby is really about Nick in many ways, right? We also have omniscient versus limited. So this is how much does the narrator know? So if you're like reading first person fiction where the person telling the story is the person doing stuff like, well, I first went here and then I did this, right? That is a limited narrator. They're only going to understand and see what's going on when they are there. An omniscient narrator hops heads. They're going to see the story through multiple viewpoints. So that is going to give us a different understanding. Sometimes it's called the God view, right? That we see everything that's going on. And, there are different ways of ratcheting up tension, right? If you're just seeing something from one point of view, then you can be really surprised when things happen. If you're hopping into other people's heads, then you know if the hero is going to be betrayed because you've been in that scene where his best friend is plotting to steal his girlfriend, right? So again, think about who is telling this, how much do they know? And then again, usually first person or third person. So you've got that external narrator that's talking about them. What are they doing? Or a first person, here I am in this scene. What am I doing? Right? So realize that that's going to have a difference in how the story is told. Another important aspect of literature is irony. So irony is basically a contrast or description between what is and what people thinks is, right? And so you have verbal irony where I say something but I mean just the opposite. Oh, you are so handsome. All right. Well, there's humor. So a lot of humor is in verbal irony. Irony of circumstance or situational irony. So what we think is true isn't. So if you've ever got like a fish out of water story where you've got somebody that's thrown into a circumstance that's beyond their understanding, that can have irony. But again, if I think one thing is going to happen, but something just opposite of that happens, that creates situational irony. And then dramatic irony is usually in theater, so with plays. And this is where the characters on the stage act and say things that I in the audience know is not true. And this can create humor or it can create tension, right? When Oedipus curses the person who killed Laius and his family, well, when this was written, Sophocles knew that his audience would know the entire story of Oedipus, right? It was a common story. So he knew when Oedipus said that, the audience was going to go, oh, shut up, you fool, you've just cursed yourself. Because Oedipus doesn't know that he's the one who killed Laius, right? So that creates dramatic irony and tension. Now, if it's a comedy and the character says something that is a misunderstanding, like there's a story called Charlie's Aunt. It's a comedy of manners written in the 1800s where this guy that's always been kind of a playboy, he's fallen in love with the girl who comes from a very conservative family. and her aunt is coming from Brazil. Charlie's aunt is coming, and she is going to be the one. She's the guardian of this girl that he loves. So he's trying to get the parents to approve his suit of their daughter. And if he can get Charlie's aunt, who has married somebody down in Brazil and nobody's seen in a long time, if he can get them to think that she approves of him, then they will approve the suit. So she's delayed, so he dresses up like her and pretends to be her. Well, the real Charlie's aunt shows up, but she's much younger than people assume. So she sees what's going on and she pretends that she's just someone else. So every time they're in a scene together, and he's talking about stuff, we know that she knows what the truth is. So when he says stuff that we know isn't true, we're like laughing at him because that's that humor, right? So what is versus what we think is, that creates that tension. And again, depending on the kind of discrepancy, it can give us humor or it can give us tragedy. But we should also always look for those things. Other terms that are relevant, the setting, this is like the time and the location. And location can be not only a geographical place, but actually be a physical place. So it's in Oklahoma City at the Skirvin Plaza, right? And what time is it? What is the era? What is the actual specific day and hour? So again, setting has a lot of different things that might be really important. Setting is not always crucial, but if it's set in the winter, that can mean that things happening have different consequences than if they would have happened in the summer. Let's say a family is evicted in the middle of winter in, Wisconsin. Well, that's going to be very different than if they're evicted in the summer, right? Because the weather is going to have more of effect. The theme is, what is the main point of this? So plot is just what actually happens, but that's not what it means. The theme is, what is this about? And you can have major and minor themes, especially if a work is really long, and people can disagree what the theme is. So again, this is going to be something that you look for. What do you think is the most important thing being discussed here? And I think it's important to realize that there might have been what the author intended, but once a work leaves that author's possession and is published, then it becomes something that other people can own in terms of what's going on. So we have the right to see themes in it that maybe the original authors didn't intend. Especially if we're talking about something that's been written hundreds of years ago, that for a modern audience might play very differently. So we read something that at its time was a piece of heroic fiction, but we read it and we see that it is a horrible piece of misogyny and oppression, right? Because we have very different standards. So again, theme can be one of those things that we disagree about. As long as you can give evidence and a really good reason why, then that's okay. Symbols, these are those things that we talked about, figurative language. How do we convey meaning in things that is maybe doubled, right? Or it's not necessarily just the obvious. So like a metaphor and similes are comparisons. Metaphor is direct. My love is a rose. Simile is a little bit less direct. My love is like a rose, right? You always have to have like or as with a simile. So these are important ways, not only in poetry, but even in fiction, that we try to convey some kind of meaning. Now, if we think about though that my love is a rose, well, roses definitely smell good, but they're also really persnickety, right? They can be a pain to grow. You have to really give them a lot of attention. They have thorns, right? So when we look at what someone is saying, we have to say, okay, someone on the surface might think that that's positive, but a rose can hurt, right? And so what are they really saying? So we have to think about that symbolic language. An allegory is a story where everything in the story represents some abstract idea. So you might have a main character named well, in the Middle Ages, we had plays like the morality plays where you had characters named Pride and Great and Mercy and stuff like that. And so they were a character, but they were supposed to represent this concept, this seven deadly sins or something. Some allegories are a little bit more subtle than that. In the The Fairy Queen by Spenser. Una is the woman that the Red Cross Knight is trying to rescue. Una stands for the one true faith, Catholicism. Una, one, right? Hyperbole is where there is a huge exaggeration. Again, usually creates drama or humor. So I have an example here. Right, so this is where Elf is confronting the department store Santa. That he knows that's not the real Santa. You sit on a throne of lies, right? I mean, that's an exaggeration of what's going on, and it's funny. But exaggerations can also bring tension as well, right? So my other link is not working for this one, so I'm going to see if I can find it. Oh, let me spell night right. So this is an example of understatement. So understatement is just the opposite of hyperbole. Hyperbole is exaggerating something greatly. Understatement is understating, right? And so let me see, let me find the place. Okay. He's getting ready to have his arm cut off. I'm just going to let you know that. Okay, so the idea of calling having your arm cut off as but a scratch is an example of understatement that brings a lot of humor, right? So again, those are two techniques that authors use to either create humor or create tragedy. In an understatement, it can be humorous, but let's say that someone has understated the severity of something. So they are fooling people into maybe signing up for some kind of task, but they've understated how dangerous it is, right? Well, then that creates tragedy or sadness or anger, right? So both of these can be used for different kind of emotional responses in the reader. The last part of this PowerPoint that you'll find are questions for analyses, and I'm not going to go over these in individually, just to know that if you really want a place to help start your analysis, these questions can help you use the elements that we talked about and show you how do you question a story about that, right? How is the conflict resolved, right? Where does the primary action take place? Are the events or incidents the plot represented in flashback or in chronological order, right? These can help you break down what's going on and maybe figure things out. So again, that's for you to use if you need the help. There are lots of other questions that you can ask, but those are some generic ones that are usually pretty static. Okay, well, I hope that helped give you a real grounding in some basics. Excuse me. Again, as we come across works in the class, I will also supplement this information with any kind of symbolic or figurative language or genre terms that are more related to the particular genre or group or time period so that you'll have that as well. All right, see you in the next video. Bye-bye.